When you're exploring a ketogenic diet or you're in a ketogenic diet, one of the things that may come to mind for you is how is exercise going to be affected? Or how does exercise affect your ketogenic diet? Well, in order to understand the different kinds of exercise and how they can actually affect your state of ketosis, we have to have a very basic understanding of how ketosis works in the body. Then we have to have a basic understanding of the different forms of energy required when it comes down to exercise, aerobic or anaerobic. So first off, let's take a quick look at what ketosis is. So when you are deprived of carbohydrates, or you are in a state of starvation, or you're fasting, that's when your body starts to produce ketone bodies. Essentially, your liver produces ketones as an alternative fuel source when you're in a mode of starvation. Now, what we also have to remember is that the body is always going to require a little bit of glucose. I want to drill this into your head early in this video so that you remember it throughout all the science that I'm going to throw at you. Your body will always require some glucose, particularly your brain. And no matter what state of ketosis you get yourself into, your body is always going to try to find anywhere between 15 and 20% glucose to fuel the brain. It may get it from proteins, it may get it from stored glycogen, but it's going to find it somehow. So a lot of time, ketones are produced by your body simply as a protective mechanism for your body to be able to spare glucose for brain function. Therefore, ketones get to be used for the lungs, get to be used for the muscles, get to be used for the heart, while glucose is spared for the brain. So if we understand that, we can understand a little bit about how glucose is not necessarily a bad thing, it just has to be in the equation naturally. But when we understand how the body produces ketones in a mode of starvation, we can also understand how exercise can induce ketosis. Now, I'm not saying that you can go out and do a bunch of exercise and necessarily pop right into ketosis, but exercise is basically a rapidly stimulated form of fasting. What you're doing when you're exercising is you're mobilizing free fatty acids quite rapidly. You're mobilizing those fatty acids to the liver where they're ultimately going to be converted into ketone bodies. The liver takes those fatty acids, converts them into what's called acetyl coenzyme A. Then that acetyl coenzyme A gets converted into acetoacetate. That acetoacetate then gets converted into beta-hydroxybutyrate or ultimately acetone, which can be used as a source of fuel or expelled from the body. So when you're exercising, you are in a sense going into ketosis, but you're not necessarily in a dietary state of ketosis. You're not in nutritional ketosis. You're in more exercise-induced ketosis. But it goes to show that our body does eventually get there and start using ketone bodies. But now we have to take it the next step. We have to look at the different forms of exercise, aerobic versus anaerobic, and we have to understand how that happens. So intensity is really what drives our shift from aerobic activity into anaerobic activity, or what drives our shift from utilizing free fatty acids as a source of fuel to ultimately using glycogen, which is stored carbohydrates, or intramuscular triglycerides. As we slide up in intensity, our body changes what it uses as a source of fuel. When we are running at moderate to high intensity, like 75% of your maximum heart rate, generally speaking, your body's going to start to utilize muscle glycogen, your stored forms of carbohydrates that are in your muscles. But what about when we're running on aerobic activity, when we're going a little bit slower? Well, here's the thing. Here's where we have to understand the mitochondria, and this is where ketosis comes into play. The mitochondria is pretty cool. The mitochondria can utilize glucose combined with oxygen to create fuel. It's a pretty magical thing. The problem is that once we start increasing our intensity, our bodies don't have the ability to keep up. So basically, they don't have enough time to get oxygen into the mitochondria. The glucose can still get to the mitochondria, but there's no oxygen there to be paired with it. Remember, anything that's occurring in the mitochondria as far as energy is concerned requires a little bit of oxygen. For glucose to create energy, it needs oxygen. So once we're working out so hard that we can't get enough oxygen in fast enough, then the glucose has to start creating energy outside the mitochondria. Now let's jump to ketones for 1 second. Ketones can also be used for fuel in the mitochondria, but also need oxygen. So we can use glucose or ketones for energy in the mitochondria whenever we're doing aerobic activity. Now here's the cool thing. Ketones are a much cleaner energy. When our body uses glucose inside the mitochondria, it creates a ton of reactive oxygen species. So yes, literally, if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates and you're doing cardio, you're actually creating a lot of cellular waste, whereas ketones and cardio create a very clean environment and a very clean kind of energy. It's like using a clean kind of fuel or a clean gasoline versus using some really, really grody gasoline that's going to really make the environment toxic, right? It's a simple way of looking at it. Now here's the caveat. Ketones can only be burned in the mitochondria. So what that tells us is that ketones cannot be used as an anaerobic source of energy. And some of you that like to lift, or some of you that are into the more high intensity exercises might be saying, darn it, I love ketosis, I'm not giving myself energy. Well, there's kind of a caveat, because a lot of the studies are a little bit contradictory. There's studies that show general physiology that show, yes, aerobic and anaerobic activity are two totally different things, but there's a lot of studies that are taking a look at ketones and finding that ketones actually can give you a little bit of strength. But here's the interesting thing. It comes down to the fact that we're sparing glycogen. Now, this is a little bit of my own hypothesis, but it's based off of an interesting study. You see, this study had taken a look at high-performance athletes, and these high-performance athletes endured 1 hour of intense cycling exercise. But before they did that cycling exercise, they gave them either a ketone ester drink, so exogenous ketones, or they gave them a carbohydrate drink, or they gave them a fatty acid drink. Well, it was pretty interesting because the ketone ester group ended up having lower levels of plasma glucose, lower levels of free fatty acids, and lower levels of lactate, which goes to show that they were using ketones as a source of fuel and were sparing the glycogen. So that's one thing that we do know. Ketones are glycogen sparing. When we have ketones in our body, whether it's exogenously or through our nutrition, through our diet, our body stores carbohydrates. But here's my theory. When we are in a state of ketosis, we are glycogen sparing. We're sparing carbs, right? That means that we're able to use that glycogen that constantly is being spared. Because we spare that glycogen, we have some glycogen to use. It's not like we just run on ketones and we have no carbs at all. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video? Our body will create carbs somehow, and those carbs can still get stored as glycogen. So what is the actual result? What should you be doing in this case? Because I know I've rambled and I've talked about a couple different things. Well, my philosophy is you should keep your training extremely short, and here's why. If you're going to be doing any kind of resistance training or anaerobic activity, if you keep it short, you can activate the small amount of glycogen that is in your system. But the bulk of what you're going to want to be doing when it comes down to body composition is going to be either cardio, or it's going to be cardio-oriented weight training in a higher repetition range. It may not be the best for building muscle, but it's going to be good for recomposing your body and changing how you look, simply because you're able to use a little bit of the glycogen and then you're able to shift over to ketone utilization for fuel where you can burn more fat. So I'm talking about keeping your workouts less than a half an hour. Yes, literally keeping them short and focusing more on like time under tension kind of things. Okay, but what about when it comes down to strength, when it comes down to building a little bit of muscle too? We can't forget that we have the creatine phosphate system, okay? We have the CP system that uses a whole different mechanism for energy. We're talking about, for example, the first 1 to 4 repetitions in heavy weightlifting. That is run on an entirely different chemical system called the creatine phosphate system. Okay? It creates energy from separating a phosphate molecule and combining a creatine molecule. That requires no oxygen, that requires no ketones, and it doesn't even require glucose. It's an entirely different system in the body. And we, with that, can have at least the first 1 to 4 repetitions covered before we run out of ketone strength or glucose strength, right? So my philosophy on that is, if you're going to lift heavy in the 3 to 4 rep range and focus on that. But it doesn't mean you have to do that. It's just if you're into that. So that's what I personally like to do. I rotate out heavy lifts utilizing the creatine phosphate system, and I stay out of the general 8 to 10 repetition range, and I start going a little bit higher rep on my other reps. Now, I hope that that makes sense. Basically, what we're trying to do is game the system. We're trying to recognize that in ketosis, our body does not thrive in an anaerobic system, but it does thrive in an aerobic system. We just have to make sure that we understand the time intervals. I know this was a very complex topic and I might have lost some of you, and I apologize, but my videos are not always going to be this in-depth and always this scientific, but I needed to break down my philosophy behind my training style and how you can understand how ketosis works for you. So as always, keep it locked in here on my videos, and if you have ideas for future videos regarding ketosis, fasting, anti-inflammatory diets, lifestyle, business, whatever, you name it, I'll be sure to check them out. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you soon.